Subcommittee will come to order. At the conclusion of opening statements yesterday, the chair called up HR 1301, and the bill was open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill, HR 1301? Are there any amendments to HR 1301?
Mr. Chairman.
If not, I now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, for nearly 3 decades, a large segment of amateur radio operators have been prohibited from installing any form of functional antennas on their own homes due to land use restrictions. For those of you that do not know, amateur radio operators perform a number of vital functions to help establish communications for our first responders during disaster. When the rest of the communications infrastructure goes down due to a disaster, it is hams that are able to patch through communications for our first responders so that they're able to effectively communicate, which is a vital and life-saving function. As the FEMA director recently said, quote, "I think there's a tendency to believe we've done so much to build infrastructure and resiliency in all of our other systems that when everything else fails, amateur radio is oftentimes our last line of defense. When you need amateur radio, you really need them." It's important to note that when many of these regulations were first put into place, land use restrictions throughout the country were much less pervasive, but over time, these areas have become more and more prevalent, which is not necessarily a bad thing by any means, but just as we've done in our committee time and again, it's good to look back at laws and regulations that were put into place long ago to make sure that they're kept up to date with the ever-evolving pace of innovation and change. Over the past 30 years, while these other land use restrictions have been in place, the flip side of this issue and the basis for this legislation is that FCC policy requiring municipalities to reasonably accommodate the placement of antennas for amateur radio use has worked wonderfully. Antenna height, configuration, and aesthetics have been subject to municipal jurisdiction under the FCC's reasonable accommodation policy. The relationships that have been built on the basis of cooperation following these standards between the licensees, land use planners, and reasonable regulations has resulted in a process that retains the decision-making power to the municipalities while allowing amateur radio operators to have the equipment necessary to effectively complete their functions. This is exactly the model on which we put together this legislation through a reasonable accommodation standard. There's nothing in this legislation that would prohibit the review or approval of amateur radio antennas before their placement or to prohibit them in certain common areas. However, I do understand the concerns that have been brought forward by parties impacted by this legislation. I'd also like to thank those parties for their willingness to come forward to reach a consensus on this issue before we reach the full committee markup on the bill. I understand some scheduling issues prevented us from having new language for today's markup, but it's my sincere hope that we'll be able to work together to find a solution that works for everybody in this issue. And this is something, Mr. Chairman, that I think is very indicative of this committee, is our ability on both sides to come together and work through issues, sometimes as niche as this, but very important, and other times even bigger issues. So I appreciate the both sides of the aisle willing to work together on this. And I just want to make one more point. You know, as a military pilot, with some of the new technology, I remember flying, back in 06, 07 overseas, and using amateur radio operators to pass messages. In some cases, it was encoded messages that nobody understood what they meant, but they were passed to our command post, which had a mission status, or sometimes you can even, in a very doomsday scenario, receive an encoded message from and through these operators. And lastly, they also do phone patches. If you want to call your mom back in Bloomington, Illinois, you can have these operators do a phone patch and do it through the radio. So personally, I have appreciated what they do from a very small perspective of just flying overseas with the military. And again, Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank everybody involved in helping to get this done, and I look forward to this bill passing. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for his good work on this legislation and his time. Are there other members? Yes, I now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Escher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Mr. Kinzinger for his legislation. This is a bipartisan bill. You've worked hard on it, and it shows because there are over 100 co-sponsors. So while we have some concerns about, the bill having impacts on homeowners associations. I appreciate Chairman Walden saying that that we'll work this out, as you said, and so we're prepared to move this along with a voice vote. So thank you for your work, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I would move strike the last word. I feel like I have to say something since I'm one of the only licensed amateur radio operators in the Congress. And I concur with what Mr. Kinzinger said. You know, it's not just in emergencies that amateur radio operators are active. I know my own hometown of Hood River, the radio amateurs of the Gorge are often active in helping communicate with communications during various community events, non-emergency events, the cross-channel swim. There are all kinds of bicycling competitions and all, mountain biking and all, where they will be the communications network to help facilitate safety in many cases for the runners or the swimmers and all that kind of communication. And then certainly when the lights go out and the power goes out and everything else goes down, many of these amateur radio operators then have their own generators. They have their own communication systems that are backed up by generators and perform that emergency communication. And in addition to just the voice communication, as you probably know, one of the best ways to get through when everything else fails is old Morse code, da 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 da. I mean, you go through it, and that can get through when nothing else can. And so I think this is really important. And with today's technology and the different bands that amateur radio operators can operate on, you don't necessarily have to have a giant tower blocking everybody's view in a community living situation. Literally, you can get a 2-meter antenna that's probably a foot high with a mag mount that you can put up on the roof or somewhere. And, you know, the Supreme Court has stepped in some of these cases for satellite communication. There was a period of time when they tried to prohibit little satellite dishes in these home situations. And the court came in and said, you know, for television, you can't just have a blanket ban. We think the same should apply to amateur radio. That certainly there can be some reasonable prohibitions, but a blanket ban is probably shouldn't be legal, and B, really takes away an emergency communication tool that, frankly, in the case of a tornado or a hurricane or a flood or something, people in those homeowners associations may be glad they got a ham radio operator next door that can fire up their rig and communicate and get a signal out when everything else fails. So I congratulate the gentleman for his work on this legislation. I encourage the parties who are still negotiating out there, get your work done sooner rather than later, because we intend to move this bill in full committee and get it across the House floor soon. So we appreciate the good faith negotiations that have gone on. We look forward to those coming to a conclusion sooner rather than later, because I think there's common ground that can be achieved here, reached here, and I just think it's really important to get done. So with that, I'd yield back the balance of my time. And are there other members seeking recognition on the minority side? Are there other members on the Republican side seeking recognition? Seeing none. The question now occurs on forwarding HR 1301 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported.